Hi, I'm Peter Shepard. I'm a carpenter, student and climate activist. And today I'm going to talk about the Flying Less initiative, which came out of the US primarily. I'll talk about its history, a progress report, and I guess why it would be great if everyone could sign on. So yeah, second slide. So to start, here's a picture of fuel tanks by the Toronto airport. Now a pipeline between Sarnia and the airport. And lastly, the North Sea oil rig I worked on 40 years ago after dropping out of university. And then 10 years ago, I joined a carbon rationing action group. One of the main instigators is at the back of it is Anders Hayden there in Toronto. The carbon rationing action groups came out of the UK. It was a network. And so we started one in West Toronto. It lasted about a year. We pledged to reduce our carbon by about 10% per year. But we just found there wasn't enough context in which to maintain the effort back then. Probably because we hadn't developed an understanding of both climate psychology and institutional change. So I guess the lesson learned from that, which I apply now, is that, as others have said, is that the academic flying less shouldn't be about guilting people into sacrifice. It's more about organizing for change and reducing energy demand. And enjoying what we have close at hand, and living our lives more equitably. Maybe the third slide. Okay, in the last decade, it's moved from being a niche debate to more of a larger movement, and now being led by academics from many different fields: ICT, digital humanities, and natural sciences. And then in the UK, there's Rob Hopkins, Transition Town, and climate scientist Alice Larkin and Kevin Anderson. And then in North America, there's climate scientist Peter Kalmus at the Jet Propulsion Lab, and Naomi Klein here. And then the authors of the petition, Park Wild and John Nevins, who wrote it in 2015. It was originally endorsed by 56 scholars. Now there's 489 signatures, 50 of whom are Canadian. So next slide. So here's the actual asks of the universities. It's to track all university-related flying, as Simon was pointing out at UBC is being done. Anything at Ryerson, they do that in a very crude way already at many universities. Then to work to realize marked reductions commensurate with the cuts suggested by climate science, establish and publish short and medium-term benchmarks, and influence professional associations to reduce reliance. Then next slide is the very similar asks for academic societies, except for the last one is to meet key professional objectives, which sort of gets back to what Constance was saying, is that you have to maintain the ability for grad students to get jobs and to meet people. It has to be equally effective, which is a very tricky thing to do, because right now we rely on in-person meetings to do that. So yeah, next slide. In the UK, which is probably about 5 or 10 years ahead of North America, it seems, the state incentivized universities to write carbon management plans about 10 years ago. So Cambridge recognized that the Higher Education Funding Council, on the slide on the right, sort of the second paragraph down on the right side, is the Cambridge recognizing that the Higher Education Funding Council of England regards mitigation as so important that they thought that future capital, they said that future capital funding should be linked to institutional performance in carbon reductions. So that would be an incredible lever. Like basically, if you don't reduce, you won't get your infrastructure funded to the same level. So the next slide. These are Cambridge University's Scope 1 and 2 emissions on the left. And that's part of the Global Reporting Initiative's core reporting responsibilities. They always report Scope 1 and 2, which is basically your site-based emissions. But Scope 3, for some reason the world, I guess you can sort of see why, in terms of the administrative approach, the World Resources Institute, which set these scopes up, and which are used by the IPCC and the GRI, they made aviation separate and sort of somewhat discretionary. And also because it's often not paid by the institution itself, like a lot of us paid for our own tickets. So, and same thing with, like, when I worked in the North Sea, the company flew me out from Aberdeen out to the North Sea. I never paid for it, but it was like, that would have been 9 tons. Had I stayed doing that, that would have been like 9 tons a year of emissions. But I wouldn't have been paying for it, so it would have been, the money would have been attributed to the ICI sector, not to me personally. So then I guess the next slide is the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, and now has a travel strategy that's mostly probably due to Kevin Anderson, but they have no fixed target yet in terms of having an actual carbon budget to work to. And then next slide, there have been 3 conferences in North America held under the Flying Less Initiative, 2 in 2016. Then they wrote from the experience of those 2 a substantial white paper and practical guide. And then there was a 3rd conference at Tufts using the same method. It's much cheaper and more equitable than a conventional conference, especially for people in developing and emerging countries, and also the unwaged can join it, even within countries. It's just so much easier for the unwaged to participate. And their format is very different. It's neither a webinar, nor is it, they hold it over several weeks, and you often have like canned presentations, so then people have time to respond electronically. It's really interesting that way. It's very, very different than other formats. So in the next slide, some technical and policy solutions are offsetting, but this is a very weak one. According to a recent study by the Stockholm Environmental Institute, only 1 to 13% of carbon offsets are fully valid and equitable in terms of international equity, because if you follow like the so I personally still think it's better to buy well-chosen offsets from the best source, in large part because it forces you to do your own carbon budget. And ending subsidies in Ontario in 2018, jet fuel received $195 million in subsidy through reduced fuel taxation. And yeah, train is about 10 to 30% more efficient than flying, but rail would be much more so if it received the same support as cars and planes. And avoid the single action bias, ask people to do their own footprint, then let them decide what to give up. Do your own carbon budget and check the numbers. Next slide. To date, no universities or academic societies have endorsed the Flying Less petition. There are strong individual proponents in at least 4 societies. However, none have endorsed the initiative or proposed comparable action. So I think it's easier to get small academic societies to sign up than to plan adoption by Congress and universities. This is an excellent opportunity for those of us in Canadian societies to lobby within our groups and to go to the website and sign up individually. If you want a reminder, please, I can sign up, take a list here. And then finally, last slide, here's some great books on the movement. First by Peter Kalmus, second by Canadian marine biologist Brett Favaro. Okay, thanks a lot.